So hello everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's session, Azure Data Engineering Services used to analyze data. So just to set some realistic expectations straight from the start, this is a 20-minute session, and in that session we're going to give an overview of some Azure Data Engineering services. We're going to mostly focus on the services that are used to analyze data, which are related to the Azure Data Engineering Associate Certification, namely Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics. However, we will cover a few other services as well before we get to them.
And let's introduce ourselves before we get started.
Sure. So my name is Kevin Chant. I'm a lead BI and analytics architect living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you can probably tell from the accent, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. So, worked in IT since the days of Windows 95. I've worked in various sectors. I have a fair few certifications.
Quite a lot.
Yeah, one or two, including the Azure Data Engineer Associate Certification, which is quite relevant for this very short session. And I'm a data platform MVP as well. You can find me online in a few different places. However, I think now it's time to go over to Kai, who's going to introduce himself for the first time.
All right. My name is Cordewener. I'm a BI and analytics engineer from the middle of the Netherlands. I have a master's degree in cognitive neuropsychology, and I've done research into visual processing and attention. It's there where I picked up a fascination with data. I've got a variety of nerdy hobbies, including both reading and writing. And after I picked up a bunch more visualization tools to show all the cool stuff we found during my research, I transitioned into the IT, where we have something new to show you almost every week. You can find me on social media and Twitter mostly with the Kai Cordewener tag.
And there's something else that you kind of forgotten to mention today, isn't there, Kai?
I mean, yes, I guess so. I'm a first-time speaker here at SQL Bits, so it's all quite exciting for me.
So yeah, this is Kai's first session for the data platform community, so it's interesting.
All right, now that that's out of the way, let's give the overview. We're going to discuss 5 data engineering services. The first one is going to be Azure Stream Analytics. We're going to move on to Data Explorer, Data Lake Analytics, Azure Databricks, and Azure Synapse Analytics. And then I'll hand it over to Kevin for the first one.
Fine, so yeah, first of all, we're going to quickly cover Azure Stream Analytics. And this is a service that's typically used to analyze streaming data. So
would have figured.
Coming from various services, including both Azure IoT and Event Hub related services. So what happens is the data tends to come into Azure Stream Analytics from those services, and it then gets processed to be used elsewhere. So you can actually group the amount of time and the length, basically, of the data that's been collected through these streaming services. And you can actually set this using a SQL-like language. And the way you actually do this is by using something called a window. And it can output to a variety of sources, including Azure Data Lake Storage and Azure SQL Database, with Data Lake Storage being the most common one. And I can actually quickly show you this now, if I go to the right one. So here you can see there's just a quick example of where you can enter in the SQL to group together, organize all your groupings for the data. Now, back over to you.
Yeah, the next one we'll cover is Azure Data Explorer. This one is ideal when you have a high velocity of data and require low latency. High velocity meaning that you're receiving thousands or maybe even millions of inputs every second. And low latency means that you need all of these inputs processed within milliseconds, if not less. Think, for example, about a long oil pipeline with pressure sensors every couple of meters. Or maybe you have an entire fleet of transport vehicles sending you GPS data. This data can be processed through batch or streaming modes for the real-time analysis. You might want to use streaming modes in situations where you're, for example, checking the temperature within a museum exhibit where you need a long continuous line of data that's being input. But if you are receiving data from very different locations, such as the transport vehicle fleet I was talking about, it's probably better to use batch mode, where it can be processed in batches and making sure you have no time lag or changes in your entries. To query all of this data, you're going to use the Custo query language, whether or not it is streamed or stored in your cluster data warehouses used behind the scenes. Custo is an open source language, and it has a very useful cheat sheet on the Microsoft page where you can see some very common SQL statements and how you would write those within Custo. When you're done with your streaming, you can export it to Azure Data Lake Storage, and there's also a variety of visualization tools built within, as well as some native integration with Power BI and Databricks that we'll cover later.
Yeah, seems to be a bit of a theme with data lake storage.
Indeed. So let's discuss data lake analytics. This is what you want to use when you want to perform analytics on a very large scale. It can be stored in Generation 1 data lakes, and that's an important note to consider because it does not work on Generation 2 data lakes, which are becoming more popular. Data lakes analytics can query your data efficiently using something called parallelization. This means it sends your query out to all of the different nodes behind the scenes, and those send your query on to different partitions of your data, returning the merged results very efficiently. It's a concept that might sound familiar to those of you who have worked with Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pools. It uses a language called USQL, which is a combination of SQL and C#. For those familiar with SQL here, the most recognizable thing will be the syntax that's used, because you start up building some script sections with C#, and within those you use SQL statements to query your data.
I suppose it's over to me quickly now then. So let's quickly talk about Azure Databricks. Does anybody use Azure Databricks before I start talking about it? Nope. Okay then. So you can basically think of Azure Databricks as a front layer to work with all the data within what's known as Spark clusters. Now, for those of you with a SQL Server background, you can think of Spark clusters along the lines of using in-memory OOTP across multiple nodes or virtual machines. Now, you use all of these clusters basically to do all the work, to do a lot of various things like data engineering and intensive machine learning tasks. And I've clicked a bit too far there. And you tend to do this by sharing code and compute within the Databricks service. I will just click quickly one back here.
Not quite time for that one yet.
No, I'm very keen. I've got a new speaker with me, don't you know? So yes, so you share the code and compute in Databricks, and you share the code by working with notebooks. Now, notebooks might be familiar to those of you who have used other services or Azure Data Studio, and I do believe somebody in this room has done some notebook work in the past. So, in addition to that, if you use the premium tier of Azure Databricks, you can actually tie in with the RBAC, role-based access control, I should say, that comes with Azure Active Directory. Like I said, it's got various capabilities, and right now they're also pushing for a new paradigm to be used called a data lakehouse. Those of you who have been here at SQL Bits for the last couple of days have probably already heard this being mentioned. Traditionally, what you have done in the past with services like Databricks is worked with the data that you've got stored in Azure Data Lake Storage, done all your data engineering and machine learning in there, and then move your data to another service for long-term storage, for example, various data warehouse solutions.
All very complicated.
However, they're now promoting this new paradigm, and what they are suggesting is that instead of moving the data to another service, just actually transform, cleanse it, or whatever you want to do, and actually put it in new files in Azure Data Lake Storage. And that's why they are calling it a data lakehouse. Now, to help work in this kind of way, they actually encourage you to use something called a Delta Lake. Now, when you use a Delta Lake, you work with something called a transaction log, which is probably familiar to those of you who have worked with SQL Server in the past. And that's so it can keep the data and the files consistent as it moves across to be used as part of the long-term storage solution. And I can actually give you a quick demo of how Databricks looks now in a workspace. So,
Always the best part.
indeed. Has anybody actually used Databricks before in the past? Nope. Well, this will be a very nice intro for all of you then. So, when you first go into Databricks, you get the choice of going into 3 different areas. And what I will actually do is zoom in and make this a bit bigger. So data engineering, machine learning, or SQL. Whichever one of those you choose changes your experience in the workspace. Now I'm just going to go through some of the extra parts of the data science and engineering here to help. So you have the workspace, and this is where you share your code in the notebooks. Now, these can be notebooks that you've created, or you can download common ones online to work with if you're just starting out with Databricks. I can actually show you an example one here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, hopefully it opens up. So as I mentioned earlier, these notebooks can use 4 different languages, so Python, Scala, Java, or SQL. However, in addition to that, you can actually change what language you run code on inside each of these sections, which are called cells. So by using what's known as magic, and as you can see there, I've got a %SQL, and then I'm using a very complicated SQL statement for this particular example. So I'm just going to quickly run it now. Just be aware, you probably use a slightly different code for running this. So just quickly run that. And that's it, and that's how you run the code in these cells, after creating a cluster as well, which I'll quickly show in a minute. So a lot of these other options here are quite self-explanatory, to be honest. Compute is the one where you actually create your clusters. I want to show that quickly before I give Kai the stage for Synapse. So basically, many years ago, I had to build clusters running Hadoop and Spark, which meant I had to wait for physical servers to be delivered, turn up. Then I had to basically relearn Linux to make sure it was all ready, configured correctly, secured, and everything. And then install Hadoop and Spark on them. And as you can imagine, that took quite a long time. So for me now, to be able to create a cluster just by clicking here, going for a nice GUI, is really great. Brings back some memories sometimes, but this is a lot better than how I used to do it in the past. So for those who want to learn more about Databricks, there's lots of material online, and there's obviously quite a few experts here at SQL Bits. However, for the benefit of time, we are now going to cover Synapse. So over to you.
Exactly. Last topic for today. Synapse Analytics. It is a fully integrated environment where you work from within the Synapse Studio. It's basically your go-to hub where you can find everything. You can start with your data ingestion, move on to your ETL, build fully functional pipelines, everything you want. Within the Synapse environment, you can work within Spark, SQL, and Data Explorer pools. Think of these pools as your different data storage environments. It supports its own form of Spark clusters, and in addition to this, Synapse Analytics also supports the Spark notebooks that you saw just before. Slightly different version, but same idea with a variety of languages that have magic commands. You can do anything from ETL to full-on machine learning and analytics, and even get your notebooks from other people that have been working in the field before. There are 2 versions of the SQL pools that you can use in Azure Synapse. And first off, you have the dedicated SQL pools. These used to be called Azure SQL Data Warehouse. These are the ones you want to use for your common queries, the things that you run every night and you need a report on in the morning. But you also have these serverless SQL pools. These are for when you want to do large analytics on things that are stored within data lakes, or maybe just something for like an annual report, something you don't want to do every day. You query both of these using the Transact SQL language that you might use in SQL Server as well. And lastly, we also have the Data Explorer pools. These are the ones that we mentioned earlier, the ones that can send out your query to the different nodes and query your partition data to make sure that you get all your results very quickly, even if you have large data sets.
But just so you know, I've already put up about the intro to the studio on the screen, so the anticipation is there.
It's very much there,
So
and we'll get right to
switch
that.
over and make it a bit bigger for everybody.
There we go.
Can everybody see this okay?
That works, huh?
So
this is your first look at Azure Synapse Studio. Shows you the first parts over here with the simple and most commonly used parts. You want, of course, ingest your data, analyze it, and eventually visualize it. Something you're probably going to see later on is, when you use it, is the update section as well. This one's always buzzing about with all the new developments that you can see here. So to take you through a standard way you might work with Synapse Studio, you can start off over here with your data development and integrate. Of course, you want to start with picking out some data. We have your common connectors here to SQL databases or lake databases. But also there is a very interesting set of integrations where you can see the very massive hub of supported possibilities. Of course, there is another interesting part where you go all the way to the linked data sets. You can grab a set of publicly available data, including stuff like COVID or the New York City taxis, anything you might want to use that's publicly available to support and enhance your own data. Once you have your data, you're going to move into the development section, where with the same plus button over here, you can grab SQL scripts, the custom query language, or the notebooks that we discussed earlier. I tend to just grab Kevin's because that's a lot easier.
One thing to mention in the develop section as well, does anybody here use Power BI at this moment in time? Because what you can do is actually link this section to your Power BI, well, link Synapse Studio to Power BI, and you can work with your Power BI reports directly in this particular section.
Yeah.
So that's a quite nice handy feature as well. So anyway, carry on.
Yeah, and if you have your data and your scripts, you're going to want to integrate them over here. You can start off, the most common one is just use a pipeline, and this shows the most interesting set where you can build fully within your system a set of commands. For example, maybe we want to copy some data into a Databricks notebook.
So has anybody here worked with Azure Data Factory in the past? So this will be very familiar to you.
And what you do here is you simply select through your GUI the source data sets, your sinks. You can connect them with as easy as dragging an arrow over here, and now your data that you've copied over here will be available for your Databricks setting.
And then you've got the other two hubs there, haven't you? So we better do the fast version of those two
We are
hubs,
going to do the fast version.
because we've just been told it's 1 minute. So that's to monitor everything that you do, basically, so I can monitor what Kai is doing.
Exactly, every single SQL request and on which pool they're running. And lastly, we also have the management section where you set up all of these pools and your external connections, as well as do your security and access controls.
Okay, so do you want to flip back to me? All these sections on the left, by the way, the correct terminology is hubs.
Yes.
Interesting fact, so back
There
to
you
me.
go.
So that is it, everybody. If you have any questions, feel free to catch up with us during the rest of the conference. We're here right up until the end of tomorrow. Please provide us feedback if you can. We do understand this is a fast-paced session.
Yep.
And we wanted to give you a very quick overview of these different services. I tested the QR code earlier, and it works fine. And just on that note, just our details again.
Yeah, if you have more questions, please contact us on any of the social media sites you see there.
And if you've enjoyed any of the stuff that my new co-presenter has been talking about today, the new speaker Kai, then please encourage him to create his own blog.
He's been pestering me about that all week.
Well, you have a master's in neuropsychology that kind of helps with working with data and visualization. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you all for attending this session. And we hope you all enjoy the rest of SQL Bits.
Have a good evening.